What we have here is a very special opportunity to take a hands-on look at the first generation of the Honda Accord, straight out of the Honda Heritage Collection. Big thank you to Honda for making this happen. But let's talk a little bit about this first gen Accord because it was such a significant model for the brand. So of course Honda had the Civic in the mid-1970s. The Accord came along on May 7th, 1976 as a larger, more comfortable alternative to the Civic. And boy, what a hit this was practically right off the bat. So what we're looking at here is a 78 or 79 Accord, and it's got a bunch of iconic Honda design elements from the 1970s, starting with the quad headlights, a beautiful design with these pretty deep set bezels, and then an egg crate style grille with CVCC badging there on the grille. We'll talk about that here in a second. Now the bumpers, it was the late 70s here in the US. We have pretty strict crash regulation related to low speed incidents, so you had to have these big diving board style front bumpers, which a lot of people say look funny, but if you've ever seen an older vehicle from the 70s get in an accident, these things do an incredible job of actually protecting the bodywork. Now some chrome trim around the front fascia, and I love this Honda badge with this little chrome piece that extends outward toward the back of the hood. Now as we come along the side here, first thing you'll notice, the 13-inch wheels. So nowadays the standard's 19s, 20s, 21s, but 13s provide a huge amount of sidewall and a great ride quality. I wish designers would go back to making small wheels like this because in a pothole scenario, in the event that you run over something you're not supposed to, having such a large sidewall gives you a great ride, and then little tiny disc brakes hiding there behind the steel wheels. The hood, fantastically designed hood. It hinges forward with hood louvers and some venting there along the front and a super thin A-pillar. So modern cars, a lot of thought given toward rollover protection, not so much back in the 1970s. Now along the side here, check out these rub strips. So these served a couple of different purposes. If you opened your door into someone next to you, you probably wouldn't leave a nasty ding. And then same thing if someone were to open their door into you. You got a nice little bit of plastic here to protect your sheet metal. And then the hatchback design. So the car launched in 76 as a hatchback. The iconic sedan that we know the Accord for today came along in 77. And what that meant is that you got a huge amount of space. Now, put the key into this little slot, open it up, and there you can see just how much room you got. Very high liftover height. So today we're all used to, just simply lifting your bag over. Here, you really got to hoist your luggage into the back of this Accord. CVCC badging again in the rear, that refers to the engine. You got Accord LX here in the back. The LX trim launched in 1978 and featured luxuries like power steering, air conditioning, and a clock. But that actually was on the option list. And then 5-speed logo down here, which denotes, of course, the transmission. There was a 2-speed automatic, which became available in the early 80s called the Honda-matic, but the 5-speed is definitely the one you want. All right, let's take a look underneath the hood. Now the engine in the Accord CVCC is a 1.6 liter 4-cylinder engine that is horizontally opposed. Now CVCC stands for compound vortex controlled combustion, but really it was a very high-tech combustion process back in the day that led to huge improvements in fuel economy and efficiency. Now the great thing about these engines is they're a really compact design. I was reading actually that the Accord was intended to be launched with a 6-cylinder unit, but you can see all of the space that is left on the left and the right side of the engine and the transaxle setup. But you notice that the hood folds forward here. These engines came in a variety of different combustion options. You had fuel injection, you had carbureted versions, depending on where you were in the world. 72 horsepower, not a lot of power by modern standards, but a very efficient little engine back in the day. So of course, back in the late 70s, we saw a prevalence of catalytic converters, but because of the efficiency of the little CVCC, Honda was able to make this vehicle compliant without a catalytic converter, which is why you see non-catalyst. Now the downside of that is, I imagine if you wanted to get this vehicle past emissions control today, explaining to the people it never had a cat beyond just that sticker might get a little sketchy. But one of the great things about these older Hondas is they were tailored for maintenance and self-preservation of the car, so the owner could actually go ahead and look up information like what the idle speed was intended to be, what the valve lash was intended to be, and then do the work themselves. Stepping inside this first generation Honda Accord, the first thing you notice is that the car feels very small, and of course the basic platform is related to the Civic, but just extended to make it a larger vehicle. But certainly on the inside, it's a very compact car. I mean, we're talking interior that by modern standards would be like Mini Cooper sized, but back in the day, okay, this was a good-sized car. But the big thing about Honda in the 1970s when compared to the domestic automakers was their attention to detail and their attention to quality. And even, what is this, 44 years later, 45 years later, the inside of the car is held up beautifully, and the quality on all of the controls feels incredible. So the vents, they feel really nice. These little shut and open toggles feel really nice. Even the sliders for the heat and the AC controls all feel super, super good. Now, a couple of things worth noting in here. First of all, the quartz clock in the middle of the dashboard. Below that, we do have some venting for the factory AC setup. And then, of course, we have the AM, FM radio with cassette. I wonder if someone added that aftermarket or if that was standard. And then here, small ashtray, and then the 5-speed manual transmission selector. Now, by modern standards, the throws are pretty long, but it still has that fantastic Honda feel of just being snickety in all the gear changes. It feels very precise, if not, a little bit long. Now, the early Accords had a 2-speed semi-automatic transmission called Honda-matic, which was replaced in the early 80s by a more conventional 3-speed automatic. Parking brake down here in the middle. There's no center console per se to rest your arm on. And then the steering wheel, surprisingly thick by 1970 standards, and it's got these 4 prongs which stick out, make it look like something straight out of Star Wars, with horn buttons there, hazard switch up top, but the gauges are my favorite part of this interior. So of course you do have a tachometer with the red line just under 6,000 RPM, fuel temp and water temp, but then you also have early computer controlled systems. So you've got this little computer down here which will tell you when it's time to change your tires and your oil change and your oil filter, all incorporated there in the gauge cluster. So a beautiful interior, very simple of course by modern standards, pretty small and a little bit antiquated, but it has held up beautifully because of Honda's attention to detail. I think it's so funny that, we all associate the Accord name with these large sedans, but it actually launched as a 3-door coupe or hatchback. Yeah, pretty small, pretty tiny back seat by modern day standards, and actually not a lot of headroom, which is interesting. Lap belts, of course, and then my favorite feature back here is on the back portion of these vinyl seats, you've got an ashtray. Look at that. So as Case puts it, your kids can smoke. So if you ever have the opportunity to drive one of these Hondas from the 1970s, you should definitely take it because you get a sense of the purposefulness in the engineering that Honda has incorporated into the way these cars were designed. So they're not frilly or fancy by any stretch of the imagination. They were designed to be as durable, long-lasting, and high quality as possible. Almost like driving a 1970s Mercedes, except maybe the metal's a little bit thinner. But even going on, this car's from the late 70s, we're talking nearly 50 years. The car feels incredibly tight. The steering feels good. The brakes feel good. The engine is responsive. This CVCC technology was so advanced back in the day, and it still works on modern day roads and in modern day traffic, and these little cars are just lovely. Now they feel small, they feel really compact, not as small as the original Civic, but compared to anything modern, a very intimate experience in here. But I love the steering. The weight of this hydraulic power steering is perfect. The weight of the clutch pedal, the way the brakes work, all feel just fantastic. Let's see how the acceleration is. Oh. What's interesting is if you've ever driven a CVCC Civic, especially the early ones, they're pretty slow. But this car really doesn't feel that slow. 72 horsepower. Actually accelerates pretty well. That's 30 miles an hour already. Compared to a lot of the other efficient cars of the 1970s, if you look at the Vega and the Pinto, which were these big, heavy, poorly engineered behemoths just lumbering around, this car is pretty small and sprightly and fun to drive. And this is a generation of Japanese vehicle that really killed off a lot of the American market share. What I find to be super odd about this car is that this is a really small car by modern day standards, and yet this was a family car. This was a fairly capable, well-sized car for a family back in the day. It was designed to throw a bunch of kids in the back. This was an Accord. An Accord back then is similar to an Accord today. It was just a way to get your family to and from places. And yet you could never have a 2-door hatchback today and have it be considered a family car. But by Japanese standards, especially in the 70s, it was.